So Donald Trump just watched his Iran strategy collapse. Not pivot, not recalibrate, collapse. The diplomatic framework that was supposed to produce Iranian capitulation has fallen apart. The maximum pressure campaign that was going to bring Tehran to its knees is now the reason the administration is in emergency mode, making calls it was not supposed to have to make, looking for exits it was told would not be necessary. 6 weeks ago, this president was telling the world he was winning. He was talking about strength. He was talking about obliteration. He was talking about a country that had finally met an American president who would not blink. That is where he said he would be. This is where he actually is. And the gap between those two places is the story of a strategy that was broken before it started, applied with maximum confidence to a problem it was structurally incapable of solving. That is where we are. I want to talk to you tonight about what actually happened here. Not the version that blames Iran for not surrendering fast enough. Not the version that calls this a negotiating setback that strong follow-through will reverse. The honest version. The version that starts with the specific question that the coverage is not asking clearly enough. Why did anyone believe that this particular strategy, applied to this particular country, with this particular history, would produce a different result than it has produced every single time it has been tried in the last 40 years? Because the answer to that question is the only answer that explains both the collapse and the scramble. And it is the only answer that gives the American people the information they need to understand what comes next and demand something better from the people who are supposed to be managing it. Stay with me. Because the collapse you are watching is not the end of this story. It is the beginning of a harder one. Subscribe now, because the collapse you just heard about did not come out of nowhere, and the scramble happening right now is not going to produce the outcome it is claiming it will produce, and understanding why requires going back to the beginning of a strategy that was broken before it started. That is exactly what we are going to do right now. Let me take you back to the beginning, not of this administration, of this theory. Because the theory that just failed has a history that is longer than any single presidency, and that history is the most important piece of context the current moment has, and it is almost entirely absent from the coverage that is treating this collapse as a surprise. For 46 years, since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the United States has operated from a theory about how to change Iranian behavior. The theory is that enough economic pressure, enough isolation, enough demonstration of American military power will eventually produce an Iranian government willing to make the concessions that American policy requires. Sanctions, more sanctions, military threats, covert operations, political isolation. The theory has been applied consistently and with increasing intensity across every presidential administration since Carter. And in 46 years, it has not produced Iranian capitulation. It has produced Iranian adaptation. Every time the pressure is increased, the Iranian political system has found a way to absorb it, use it for internal political cohesion, blame it on American hostility to rally public support for the government that was absorbing the pressure, and continue developing the nuclear program that the pressure was supposed to stop. This is not speculation. It is the documented record of 46 years of American Iran policy. And the current strategy is the maximum version of a theory that the maximum version of has been tried before and has not worked before for structural reasons that this script is going to explain. The Iranian political system is not organized the way the maximum pressure theory assumes it is organized. The theory assumes that enough external pressure will produce internal political costs that will eventually force a change in behavior. That assumption works in political systems where external pressure translates cleanly into internal political accountability, where governments lose power when their citizens suffer, and where leaders therefore have a structural incentive to reduce citizen suffering by changing the policies that are causing it. The Iranian political system does not work that way. It is designed to insulate the decision makers from external pressure by using that pressure as political legitimacy. Every sanction that makes an Iranian family's life harder is presented inside Iran with considerable effectiveness as evidence of American hostility to the Iranian people and their government. Every military strike is presented as evidence that Iran's revolutionary government is the only protection the Iranian people have against an adversary that wants to destroy them. The pressure that was supposed to produce capitulation produces instead the political conditions in which capitulation becomes impossible, because any Iranian government that agreed to American demands under this level of external pressure would be handing its domestic opponents the evidence they need to destroy it. The theory was not just ineffective, it was counterproductive in a structural way that experts on Iranian politics have been explaining for decades. And the people who designed the current maximum pressure strategy either did not read those explanations or decided they were wrong. They were not wrong. And here's what they don't tell you in the coverage that treats this collapse as a surprise. The collapse was predicted, not by critics who wanted the strategy to fail, by the people who understood how the system it was trying to change actually worked. The European allies who maintained the JCPOA framework after Trump's first-term withdrawal, who spent years keeping the diplomatic architecture of the deal alive in the hope that American participation could eventually be restored, warned explicitly and repeatedly that the maximum pressure strategy would produce hardening rather than capitulation. The career diplomats and Iran specialists in the American foreign policy establishment who were pushed aside or ignored as the current strategy was assembled said the same thing in classified briefings and in public commentary. The intelligence community's own assessments, portions of which have since become public, reflected the same diagnosis that the Iranian political system was structured to respond to pressure by hardening, and that without a credible and acceptable off-ramp for Iranian decision-makers, the pressure would produce confrontation rather than negotiation. Every one of those warnings has now been validated by the collapse we are watching, and the people who gave them deserve to be heard. Not because being right earns them a prize, but because understanding why they were right is the only path to a strategy that can actually work. Now, let me be honest about my own experience with this, because I think it is relevant, and I think the American people deserve to hear it directly. When I was president, I had my own encounters with the Iranian question. I watched the back-channel signals that came through in the late 1990s. And tried to understand what they meant about the state of Iranian domestic politics and what kind of engagement they might support. I had conversations with European allies who had different relationships with Tehran than we did, and who gave me their honest assessments of what was possible and what was not. And I came to understand something about the specific architecture of Iranian diplomatic engagement that I want to share with you, because it is directly relevant to the collapse we are watching. The Iranian political system operates with multiple power centers that do not always speak with the same voice. The presidency, the supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guard, the parliament, the clerical establishment, each of these centers has its own interests, its own red lines, and its own calculation of what engagement with the United States costs and what it could yield. Effective diplomacy with Iran requires understanding that architecture well enough to know which signals matter and which are theater, which back-channel communications reflect actual decision-making authority, and which reflect the preferences of a faction that cannot deliver on what it appears to be offering, and what the specific domestic political conditions are under which an Iranian government can take a genuine political risk on a negotiated outcome without destroying itself in the process. None of that knowledge can be acquired through pressure alone. It requires engagement. It requires the patient and unglamorous work of building relationships with people you distrust, of maintaining channels even when the signals coming through them are ambiguous or discouraging, of being willing to offer something real in exchange for something real, rather than demanding surrender in exchange for a reduction in punishment. The Obama administration's negotiation of the JCPOA, whatever one thinks of its specific terms, was built on exactly that kind of engagement. Years of back-channel diplomacy, years of understanding the specific domestic political constraints facing the Iranian negotiating team, A final agreement that was imperfect, that left things undone that should have been done, but that created a verifiable constraint on Iran's nuclear program and a diplomatic relationship that could have been built upon. The current administration inherited that framework, dismantled it in the first term, and then launched a military conflict in the current term as the culmination of a pressure campaign that the evidence of the previous 30 years predicted would not work. And now we are watching the predicted result. What does the panic actually look like from the outside? Because I want to be precise about this, because precision is what the gravity of this moment demands. Presidential panic does not announce itself. It expresses itself through a specific pattern of observable behaviors that anyone who has spent time around high-stakes decision-making under pressure will recognize immediately. It looks like senior officials giving incompatible accounts of the administration's position to different audiences on the same day. It looks like a rapid succession of statements from the White House that contradict each other within hours, each one designed to manage the immediate political moment without reference to whether it is consistent with the statement that preceded it. It looks like the frantic search for a formulation that allows the person responsible for the strategy to acknowledge that it is not working without acknowledging that the strategy was wrong, because acknowledging the strategy was wrong would require the accountability that the political incentive structure surrounding this administration makes impossible. It looks like the attempt to rename the collapse, to call it a tactical adjustment or a negotiating position or a recalibration, while every government that has been watching the strategy from the outside can see clearly that what is happening is none of those things. It looks like phone calls being made to allied governments that were not consulted when the strategy was being designed, asking for help managing a situation that those governments warned would arrive from people who did not listen to those warnings. It looks like exactly what we are watching right now. Let me tell you something. Scrambling is its own kind of damage. Not just because scrambled decisions are worse than deliberate ones, though they are, but because scrambling from the position of the American presidency is visible to every actor in the international system simultaneously, and every actor that is watching draws the same conclusion from what it sees. The conclusion is not that the United States is in trouble. The United States has been in trouble before and recovered. The conclusion is that the person in charge does not have a plan, which is a different and more dangerous message than trouble, because trouble with a plan attached to it is a crisis that can be managed. Trouble without a plan is a crisis that manages the person who is supposed to be managing it. The Allied reaction to this collapse is different from the Allied reactions to the previous moments in this conflict, and the difference is important. When Allied governments found out about the February strikes from news reports instead of phone calls, their reaction was about exclusion. They were frustrated at being left out of a decision that affected their interests. When they found out about the 48-hour ultimatum from social media, their reaction was about disrespect. They were alarmed that the framework of Allied consultation that the alliance depends on had been unilaterally suspended. The reaction to this collapse is different from both of those. It is the specific and particular reaction of people who were right and were told they were wrong and are now watching the consequences of being dismissed arrive exactly as they predicted. That is not frustration. That is not alarm. That is something that sits at the intersection of vindication and grief. The bitterness of having tried to prevent something and failed, and now being asked to help manage the consequences by the people who would not listen when prevention was still possible. The European governments that maintained the JCPOA framework after the first term withdrawal spent years doing the diplomatic equivalent of keeping a wound from becoming a gangrenous infection. They were not naive about what they were doing. They knew that without American participation, the deal was weakened. They knew that the Iranian government would use American absence to advance its nuclear program beyond the limits the deal set. They knew that every year without American engagement was a year in which the diplomatic architecture deteriorated, and the re-engagement that would eventually be necessary became harder and more expensive. They said all of this, publicly and privately, to every American official who would receive the message, and the message was not received. Now they are being called. Now they are being asked for their help in their diplomatic relationships and their institutional knowledge of the Iranian system. And they will provide what help they can, because the alternative is worse for them than the cost of helping. But the relationship between the United States and its European allies on this specific file, the file of Iran and the nuclear question and the framework of diplomatic engagement that was supposed to manage it, has been damaged in a way that will shape every future conversation about every related question for years. Here is the honest truth about who is paying the price for the strategy that just collapsed. And it is not the people who designed it. The 5,300 people killed in this conflict are paying it with their lives. Among them, more than 500 confirmed civilians who had no vote in the decision that started the war and no ability to prevent the escalation that produced the strategy that produced the collapse that we are now watching. The 100 Israelis wounded at Arad Damona are paying it with their bodies. The 10-year-old boy in that hospital is paying it in a way that nothing that happens in any negotiating room in any capital city will ever undo. The American service members in Gulf state bases who are under greater threat today than they were before the strategy that just collapsed was implemented are paying it with their daily exposure to a risk that has increased rather than decreased as a result of a campaign that was supposed to reduce the Iranian threat. The families paying $3.93 by gallon for gas, who were paying $2 by gallon before the pressure campaign began generating the energy market consequences that the people who designed it either did not model or chose not to disclose, are paying it every time they fill their tank. The Iranian civilians who have been living under the simultaneous weight of American sanctions and American military strikes and a government that uses their suffering as evidence of American hostility are paying it in ways that are very difficult to see from here and very easy to discount because they are far away and do not vote in American elections. The theory of change that produced all of that cost has now collapsed publicly. The question is whether the people responsible for applying it are capable of drawing the conclusion that the evidence demands, or whether the scramble will produce more of the same under a different label. All right. Let me tell you what comes next, because the scenarios the scramble is moving toward are not equivalent, and the differences between them matter enormously. In the first scenario, the scramble produces a face-saving off-ramp, some partial agreement, some temporary de-escalation, some restart of a diplomatic process that resembles in structure the process that the strategy that just collapsed had previously closed off. An agreement not to call it a defeat, a formulation that allows the administration to claim the pressure worked without the pressure having produced what it was supposed to produce. This is the best available outcome from the current position. It is not a good outcome. It is the outcome in which significant damage has been done and significant costs have been paid, and the situation that exists at the end of the scramble is structurally worse than the situation that could have been achieved through the diplomatic process that was available in February and was abandoned in favor of a strategy that the evidence of 46 years predicted would fail. The gap between what was possible before the strategy was applied and what is achievable after it has collapsed is the measure of what the strategy cost. And that cost is not recoverable. It is the permanent inventory of the theory of change that was wrong. In the second scenario, the scramble produces escalation, the panic of a president who cannot find an acceptable off-ramp, who needs to show strength because the domestic political cost of appearing to have failed is greater than the strategic cost of doing more damage, leads to military action that expands the conflict rather than containing it, more strikes, a wider target set, an operation that is designed not by strategic logic, but by the political requirement of the person ordering it to not appear to be losing. That kind of military action does not contain the fallout from the collapse. It generates a new collapse that is larger and more expensive and less manageable than the one the scramble was supposed to address. The regional conflagration that follows has no off-ramp because the off-ramp was burned in the scramble. It has no coalition because the coalition was damaged in the months of unilateral decision-making that preceded the collapse. It has no legal authorization because the war powers framework that was supposed to provide one was bypassed at the beginning and has not been restored. And it has no exit strategy because exit strategies require a definition of success that the current operation has never publicly provided. This is the scenario that the architecture of international order was built to prevent. And this is the scenario that scrambled decision-making made in panic produces when the people in the room are not there to say no. In the third scenario, the scramble produces paralysis. The administration cannot find a move that satisfies all of the constraints simultaneously. Militarily credible and diplomatically viable and politically defensible and legally authorized and strategically coherent. Those constraints cannot all be satisfied at once from the current position, because the current position is the product of months of decisions that sacrificed each of those requirements in turn. The resulting inaction is not neutrality. It is not a pause. It is the absence of a directing strategy in an active conflict with multiple armed actors, multiple state and non-state interests, and the full volatile chemistry of a heavily armed region that has been under pressure for 6 weeks. Conflicts without directing strategies do not wait for the strategy to be developed. They find their own logic. They drift toward their own escalation points through the accumulated actions and reactions of the actors inside them, independent of anything any single government decides. A drifting conflict in the Persian Gulf, with oil markets already above $100, with Gulf state infrastructure in the Iranian retaliation window, with American service members stationed across the region under explicit threat, with no diplomatic channel open and no congressional authorization providing accountability, does not stay at its current temperature. It rises, and the longer it rises without a hand on the thermostat, the harder it becomes to bring it down without burning something that was not supposed to burn. Here is the honest truth. All three of those scenarios are worse than what was possible before this strategy was applied. All three are worse than what would have been achievable if the diplomatic process in Geneva had been allowed to run. All three require more from the American people, more money, more risk, more exposure of the service members in the Gulf than the strategy that produced them promised it would cost. And none of them can be honestly presented to the American public as a success by any standard that the people who designed the strategy originally invoked when they were asking for the public's trust. That is the accounting. That is what the evidence requires. And that accounting is owed not to the people who want this president to fail, but to the American people who trusted that the strategy would work and who deserve an honest explanation of why it did not and what that cost them. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at a moment that is, in one specific and important way, different from every previous moment in this conflict. The previous moments were moments when the strategy was still running, when the people responsible for it could still argue that the process was working and that the outcome was approaching even if it had not yet arrived. This is the moment after the argument is no longer available. The collapse has happened, the scramble is visible, and the question that the American people now have every right to ask loudly and with full expectation of a serious answer is, what is the plan from here? Who designed it? What evidence does it rest on? And what accountability will exist if it fails in the same way the last one did? I am calling on every American, regardless of party, to demand exactly those answers from the people they elected to provide them. Demand a war authorization. Demand public hearings. Demand an honest accounting of what the objectives of this conflict are, what the legal framework for pursuing them is, what the evidence base for the strategy is, and what the measure of success is that will tell everyone, including the people running the strategy, when it has failed and needs to change. That is not partisanship. That is the republic asking the questions that a republic is designed to ask when its government sends people into harm's way and spends its citizens' money and its national credibility on a strategy that has now visibly collapsed. In 1991, before American forces entered Kuwait, the Senate voted 52 to 47 to authorize the use of force. That vote was hard. It was contentious. Senators stood at their desks and made the argument for and against and carried the weight of what they were deciding. And because they did that work, the strategy that followed had the accountability built into it that makes a strategy sustainable when it encounters resistance. That is how a democracy goes to war, not with a strategy no one voted on, no one publicly accounted for, and no one apparently stress-tested against the 46-year record of the approach it was built on. The lesson of this collapse is not that military force is always wrong. It is not that diplomacy is always right. It is that a strategy built on a theory that ignores the evidence of how the system it is trying to change actually works will produce the outcome that the evidence predicted, regardless of how much confidence accompanies its application. The people who warned about this were right. The process they recommended was bypassed, and the cost of bypassing it is being paid right now by the families at the gas pump and the service members in the Gulf and the civilians on both sides of a conflict that a different approach might have managed without this level of destruction. The American people deserve a government that takes evidence seriously, that listens to the people who have the relevant experience, that builds the coalitions and maintains the processes that make a strategy sustainable beyond its opening weeks, that is honest about what it is trying to achieve and what it will cost when it falls short, that is not a partisan standard. It is the standard that the gravity of these decisions has always required, and that the people bearing the cost of getting them wrong have always deserved. Pay attention. Ask the questions the scramble is designed to make you stop asking. Hold the people you elected to the standard that this moment demands, because the story of what comes after this collapse is still being written, and whether it is written from evidence or from panic will determine what it costs. The choice of which of those it is still belongs to us.